Britain's secret weapon, the armed merchant ships that starved an empire. Imagine you are the captain of a Norwegian cargo ship in the freezing winter of 1915. You are somewhere in the North Atlantic. The sea is black and heaving. Ice is forming on your railings, and the wind is screaming at 40 knots. You are carrying grain, maybe some copper wire, maybe some cotton bales. You're a neutral man from a neutral country. You are not at war with anybody. And then, out of the gray curtain of fog and spray, a massive ship appears. She is flying a British naval ensign. A signal lamp blinks at you across the water. Stop your engines. Prepare to be boarded. And just like that, your world changes. Because what is happening to you right now is not quite war, and it is not quite peace. It is something altogether more complicated, more ruthless, and more historically fascinating than either. Welcome aboard one of the most audacious and least told stories of the First World War. The story of Britain's ocean boarding vessels and the armed merchant ships that enforced the greatest maritime stranglehold in modern history. My name is your narrator, and today we're going deep into the cold, iron-gray waters of the Northern Atlantic. We're going to meet the sailors who boarded thousands of ships in hurricane weather. We're going to understand the legal battles that erupted between nations. We are going to feel the tension in the holds of neutral vessels as British officers with revolvers on their hips rifled through cargo manifests and compared invoices against intelligence lists. And we're going to understand how this entire operation, this vast, grinding, dangerous, legally ambiguous machine of economic war, helped to bring the German Empire to its knees without a single fleet engagement. This is the story of the blockade. The real blockade. Not the dramatic cannon duels and the famous battles, but the slow, methodical, almost bureaucratic process of strangulation. And it is one of the most remarkable military operations ever conceived. Let's start at the very beginning. Because to understand why Britain needed these extraordinary ships, these converted ocean liners playing the role of warships, you have to understand the geography of the situation that Britain found itself in when war broke out in August 1914. Britain in 1914 was the world's greatest naval power. The Royal Navy was the undisputed ruler of the seas. The Grand Fleet, based at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, was the most powerful collection of warships ever assembled. But power alone does not win a war. And the British military strategists had understood for decades that if a major European war ever came, the Navy would need to do more than fight battles. It would need to cut Germany off from the outside world entirely. Germany in 1914 was a continental power, yes, but it was also deeply dependent on imported raw materials. Iron or copper, rubber, cotton, food, oil, all of these things Germany needed, and a significant proportion of them came by sea. The strategists in the Admiralty had drawn up plans for what they called a distant blockade. Unlike the old Napoleonic-era concept of stationing your ships right outside the enemy's harbors, a distant blockade meant controlling the ocean approaches far from Germany's ports. And the geography of the British Isles made this remarkably achievable. Britain sits like a great geographic cork in a bottle. To the south, the English Channel is narrow enough to be relatively easily controlled. And to the north, between Scotland, the Shetland Islands, Iceland, and Norway, lies a stretch of sea through which virtually all Atlantic traffic heading to northern European ports must pass. Control that gap, and you control the economic throat of Germany and her allies. So from the very first days of the war, Britain moved to seal that gap. And this is where our story really begins, because sealing a gap of over 200,000 square miles of the most savage ocean on Earth is not a simple matter of posting a few destroyers. It required something far more extraordinary. It required the transformation of ocean liners into warships. The men who first drew up the plans for the Northern Patrol, as this great blockading force would come to be known, started with what the Royal Navy had on hand. The initial force assigned to the patrol was a group of elderly cruisers, ships of the Edgar class, old veterans that had been built back in the 1890s. They were proper warships, bristling with guns, flying the white ensign with all the dignity that implied. But they were also, in a very practical sense, completely unsuited to the job. These ships had been designed for a different era of naval warfare. They were built for the relatively sheltered waters of the North Sea or the Mediterranean. They were not built for the screaming Arctic gales and 40-foot waves of the northern Atlantic in winter. Within months, the Edgar-class cruisers were battered. Their machinery was breaking down. Their hulls were straining. Their crews were exhausted and miserable. The ships could barely keep station in the worst weather. And the worst weather, up there between Scotland and Iceland, was frequent. The sea did not care about naval strategy. The sea simply raged as it always had, and the old cruisers simply suffered. By mid-August of 1914, the Admiralty began to recognize that something had to change. And the solution they arrived at was, when you think about it, absolutely brilliant in its simplicity and deeply audacious in its execution. If your warships cannot survive the seas you need to patrol, then find ships that can. And which ships were built specifically to cross the most demanding ocean waters at speed, in all weathers, carrying hundreds of passengers in relative comfort. Ocean liners, the great civilian greyhounds of the Atlantic trade. Ships like the Alsatian, the Teutonic, the Mantua, the Armidale Castle. These were vessels built by some of the finest marine engineers in the world, constructed to cope with exactly the conditions that were destroying the Edgars. They were longer, more stable, faster, and better suited to long ocean passages. And Britain, as the world's greatest maritime trading nation, had a lot of them. So the Admiralty began commandeering them. Passenger liners were requisitioned, their elegant passenger lounges stripped out or repurposed, their holds fitted with buoyancy ballast to keep them stable under gunfire, and most critically, their decks fitted with real naval weapons. 6-inch guns, mostly dating from naval stores. For on each side, sometimes a 9th gun bolted to the bow. High-angle 3-inch anti-aircraft guns abaft the funnels. Rangefinders on the Monkey Island above the bridge. These are no longer ocean liners. They were armed merchant cruisers, or AMCs, as they became universally known. And they formed the backbone of the Northern Patrol, which would officially become known as the 10th Cruiser Squadron. The Alsatian, a magnificent Allen Line vessel that had only entered service in 1913, became the flagship of the entire Northern Patrol. Under the command of Rear Admiral Dudley de Chair, who hoisted his flag aboard her in August 1914, the Alsatian would prowl the gray waters between Scotland and Iceland for much of the war, becoming the nerve center of the most important naval operation the British were conducting. De Chair was an officer of the old school, rigorous, methodical, and deeply aware of the extraordinary delicacy of what he was being asked to do. Because here's the thing about the Northern Patrol that made it so much more complicated than simply winning a sea battle. It was not primarily a fighting operation. It was a police operation, and policemen have to follow rules. Let's talk about those rules because they are absolutely central to understanding everything about the ocean boarding vessels and the blockade. International law in 1914 regarding the treatment of neutral ships at sea was well established, at least in theory. Under the accepted principles of maritime law that had developed over centuries, a belligerent power at war had certain rights over neutral shipping, but those rights were carefully circumscribed. You were allowed to stop a neutral vessel on the high seas and check her papers, a procedure known as the right of visit and search. You were allowed to seize cargo if it was proven to be contraband, meaning goods directly useful to the enemy's war effort. And you were allowed to detain a ship if she was found to be carrying such contraband. But you were not allowed to simply sink a neutral vessel. You were not allowed to harass neutral commerce indiscriminately. And you were most emphatically not allowed to starve an entire civilian population. The problem, from Britain's strategic perspective, was that these rules as they stood in 1914 were completely inadequate for the kind of total economic war that modern industrial conflict required. The Declaration of London of 1909 had attempted to codify the laws of naval warfare in a comprehensive way, and it contained a list of what it called absolute contraband, meaning things so directly military in nature that they could always be seized, and conditional contraband, meaning things like food and clothing that could only be seized if they were specifically destined for an enemy's armed forces. Britain had actually never ratified the Declaration of London, a fact of enormous legal significance, but it had been generally expected that British forces would broadly follow its principles. And here was the problem. The conditional contraband list in the declaration was very restrictive. Under its terms, Britain could not seize foodstuffs simply because they were being shipped to a neutral port that might then re-export them to Germany. The letter of the old law protected an enormous amount of trade that Britain desperately needed to interdict. So Britain, step by step, began to quietly expand and reinterpret the law. In August 1914, when the war began, the absolute contraband list was reasonably narrow, covering guns, explosives, and obvious military equipment. But almost immediately, the British government began adding items to the list. Copper went on, then rubber, then cotton, then food. By March 1915, with a sweeping order in council, the British government had essentially established a complete blockade of Germany, one that covered all goods of any kind destined for German territory, whether directly or through neutral countries. And with that legal foundation, however legally questionable, in place, the Northern Patrol had its mandate. Stop every ship, board every suspicious vessel, inspect every cargo manifest, and send to a British examination port any ship whose cargo could not be clearly accounted for as going nowhere near Germany. Now, executing that mandate in those waters, in those conditions, was not a bureaucratic exercise. It was a feat of extraordinary seamanship and physical courage. Let me paint you a picture of what a boarding actually looked like out there on the Northern Patrol. It is a winter morning in 1916. The sea is running at 30 feet. The sky is the color of dirty pewter. A patrolling armed merchant cruiser, let us say she is one of the mid-sized vessels, perhaps 8 or 10,000 tons, sights a neutral merchantman heading south-southeast. The AMC signals the vessel to stop. The neutral ship complies, or she does not, in which case the AMC fires a warning shot across her bow, and she almost always then complies. The two ships are now heaving up and down in the swell, and the crucial question is how to get men from the AMC to the neutral ship. A boat has to be lowered. In a 30-foot sea, the boarding party clumbers down into a small steam launch or a pulling cutter, men in oilskins, armed with revolvers, clutching briefcases full of intelligence documents and contraband lists. The boat is dropped into the ocean and immediately disappears into a trough between waves. The men row or steam across the gap between the ships, which are both rolling and pitching violently. And then comes the most dangerous part, getting alongside the neutral ship and climbing up her ladder or scramble net while the boat is being thrown around like a cork. Men fell into the sea and drowned. Men were crushed between the boat and the ship's hull. Men were injured by the nets and ladders slamming against them in the swell. The ships themselves sometimes came too close and collided. This was not glamorous work. It was grinding, exhausting, physically terrifying work performed day after day, week after week, in some of the most hostile maritime conditions on the planet. And when the boarding officers actually got aboard the neutral vessel, their work was just beginning. They were looking for contraband, yes, but how do you prove that a cargo of copper wire or a consignment of cotton bales is actually destined for German war industries rather than for the stated recipient in Rotterdam or Copenhagen? This is where the boarding operation became genuinely fascinating, a kind of detective work conducted on a heaving deck in Arctic conditions. The boarding officers carried with them extraordinarily detailed intelligence documents prepared by a vast network of British agents, Foreign Office officials, consular staff, and commercial intelligence operatives throughout the neutral world. Britain had constructed an entire parallel intelligence apparatus specifically focused on trade. Agents in New York watched which goods were loaded onto which ships. Contacts in Stockholm and Amsterdam reported on which companies were known German front organizations. The British blockade authorities maintained enormous files on shipping companies, insurance firms, individual merchants and cargo brokers, and boarding officers could cross-reference the papers they found on a vessel against this intelligence to determine whether the stated destination was plausible or whether there was reason to believe the cargo was ultimately intended for Germany. The intelligence operation that underpinned the boarding effort was, in many ways, as impressive as the naval operation itself. British agents essentially created what we would now call a supply chain intelligence system. They tracked goods from their origin in American or South American or Asian factories, followed them through insurance documents and cargo manifests, and maintained watch lists of companies and individuals known or suspected to be acting as intermediaries for German procurement. When a boarding officer found a manifest listing a neutral trading company as the recipient of a large consignment of copper, he could check that company against the British watch lists and determine whether it was a legitimate Danish hardware firm or a known conduit for German military purchasing. If the latter, the ship would be detained and sent to a British port for a more thorough examination. The scale of this operation was staggering. Before the 10th Cruiser Squadron was finally disbanded in November 1917, it had intercepted almost 13,000 merchant vessels at sea. Only 642 ships managed to slip past the blockade without being intercepted. To put those numbers in context, the Northern Patrol was operating over a patrol area of 200,000 square miles of the most demanding ocean on Earth, in all weathers, around the clock, for 3 years and 4 months. It was, as one historian has called it, quite simply the most continuously active naval force of any participant in the Great War. The human cost was real. 9 armed merchant cruisers were sunk, at a cost of over 1,000 officers and men. The losses came from several causes. German U-boats prowled the patrol area, knowing that the slow and relatively lightly built merchant cruisers were vulnerable targets. 3 AMCs were sunk by submarines in 1915 alone. The Bayano was torpedoed in March 1915 off Galloway, going down so quickly that most of her crew were lost. The Avenger was torpedoed in June 1917. The conditions themselves killed men, through falls and crushing accidents during boarding operations, through the constant physical punishment of living and working in extreme Arctic weather for extended periods. And there was another danger that was perhaps less immediately fatal, but in some ways more psychologically wearing. The AMCs occasionally encountered German commerce raiders, armed vessels disguised as merchant ships, sent out by Germany to attack Allied shipping. The most dramatic such encounter came in February 1916, when the Alcantara, a Royal Mail steam packet liner serving with the Northern Patrol, intercepted a vessel that presented itself as the Norwegian ship Rena. Something seemed wrong to the Alcantara's commander, and when the vessel was approached and ordered to stop, the disguise was suddenly dropped. The ship revealed itself to be the German Raider Greif, and the two vessels fought a vicious close-range gun battle in which both ships were sunk. The Alcantara went down with heavy loss of life, but she had destroyed her opponent too. It was the kind of engagement that reminded everyone on the Northern Patrol that this was not merely a customs inspection service. It was a genuine naval operation conducted in a state of total war. Now let us step back from the operational level and think about the bigger strategic picture, because the boarding operations and the blockade did not exist in a political vacuum. They existed in a world where some of the most important nations on Earth were officially neutral, and those neutral nations were not pleased about what Britain was doing. The United States was, in 1914 and 1915, the most important neutral power from Britain's perspective. American trade with Europe was massive, and much of it had historically flowed in both directions. American farmers and manufacturers were perfectly happy to sell to Germany as well as to Britain, and they had every right to do so under international law. The British blockade was, from the American perspective, a serious infringement of neutral trading rights. American ships were being stopped. American cargoes were being seized. American businesses were losing money. The American government protested, loudly and repeatedly, through diplomatic channels. Woodrow Wilson's administration was in a genuinely difficult position. On one hand, there was real sympathy in parts of American society for the Allied cause. On the other hand, the legal arguments against the blockade were strong, and there was a powerful strand of American political opinion that wanted no part of European quarrels and resented British handedness on the seas. Britain had to manage this tension with enormous diplomatic care. Push the Americans too hard, and you risked creating genuine hostility from the only major industrial power that could, if it chose, provide decisive material support to the Allied war effort. But loosen the blockade, and you risked allowing Germany to obtain the raw materials she needed to keep fighting indefinitely. The British government walked this tightrope with considerable skill, though not without stumbles. When American cargo was seized, Britain typically offered compensation, working through elaborate prize court proceedings that could drag on for years, but at least acknowledged that neutral rights had some meaning. Britain also worked hard to bring neutral trading nations into cooperative arrangements that would reduce the friction of the blockade. The Netherlands Overseas Trust, established in late 1914, was perhaps the most successful of these arrangements. The trust was a private Dutch organization that agreed to act as a guarantor for goods imported into the Netherlands, vouching that they would not be re-exported to Germany. In exchange, British authorities would release Dutch-bound cargoes that might otherwise have been seized. Similar arrangements were reached with Scandinavian nations and other neutral powers. It was economic statecraft of a high order, combining the stick of the blockade with the carrot of continued access to British and Allied markets. The Scandinavian neutrals presented particular challenges. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark were all deeply dependent on seaborne trade, and they all sat in a delicate position between the two great belligerent powers. Norway in particular was profoundly dependent on Britain for coal and on the open sea lanes for her enormous merchant fleet. Britain could apply tremendous pressure on Norway simply by threatening to withhold coal exports, and this leverage was used, discreetly but firmly, to discourage Norwegian commerce with Germany. Sweden was a harder case. Sweden had a long tradition of supplying Germany with iron ore, and her geographic position made it difficult for Britain to entirely prevent this traffic. The diplomatic battles over Scandinavian neutrality were every bit as complex and important as the naval operations themselves. And then there was the question of what the blockade was actually designed to achieve. At the broadest level, the answer is obvious: to prevent Germany from obtaining the materials needed to keep her war machine running. But the specific mechanisms of economic strangulation were complex and evolved over the course of the war. In the early months, the focus was primarily on what we would now call strategic raw materials: metals, rubber, chemicals, petroleum products. These were the inputs that fed Germany's extraordinary industrial war machine. German steel production, her chemical industry, her munitions factories, her vehicle and aircraft industries, all depended on imported raw materials. Cut off those imports, and eventually the factories would slow, then stop. But as the war continued, and it became clear that it was going to be a long, grinding conflict of attrition, the blockade expanded its scope. Food became a weapon. The decision to declare foodstuffs as contraband was one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war, legally and morally. Under the old rules of international law, food destined for civilian populations was supposed to be protected. The idea that you could deliberately starve a nation's civilian population into submission was abhorrent to many people, not just neutrals. Even within Britain, there were voices raised against it. But the strategic logic was brutal and undeniable. Germany's food situation was inherently vulnerable. She could not feed herself from domestic production alone in wartime, particularly given how much agricultural labor had been conscripted into the army. And if food imports were cut off, hunger would not remain neatly confined to the military. It would spread to the civilian population, undermining morale, creating unrest, and ultimately making the war politically unsustainable for the German government. This was economic warfare of a totality that the world had never really seen before, and it created moral dilemmas that are still debated by historians today. The boarding parties boarding those neutral ships were not just preventing military equipment from reaching German soldiers. They were ultimately contributing to a strategy that would cause hundreds of thousands of German civilians to die of malnutrition and related diseases. The German Board of Public Health itself would later claim that the blockade caused over 760,000 civilian deaths by the time of the armistice, though academic studies have tended to put the figures somewhat lower, perhaps 400,000, with significant debate about attribution. Whatever the exact figure, It was a massive and deliberate infliction of suffering on a civilian population, and the boarding officers and the AMC crews were the sharp point of the instrument that inflicted it. The men serving on the Northern Patrol grappled with some of these questions, though perhaps not as explicitly as a modern observer might expect. They were professional naval men doing a job they had been assigned, in conditions of extreme hardship, under genuine danger. Their day-to-day concerns were much more immediate than philosophical arguments about the ethics of economic warfare. How do you lower a boat in a 40-knot gale? How do you keep your engines running when salt water has corroded your valves? How do you maintain morale among a crew of merchant sailors and naval reservists who have been at sea for months in the Arctic darkness? These were the practical problems that consumed the attention of officers and men on the Northern Patrol. The crew composition of the AMCs was itself fascinating and somewhat unusual. These ships were not Royal Navy vessels in the traditional sense. They were commandeered merchant ships, and many of their crew members were not regular Royal Navy sailors. A significant proportion were Royal Naval Reserve officers and men, meaning merchant seamen who held reserve commissions and were called up in wartime. Some ships retained elements of their peacetime merchant crews, working alongside the naval people under somewhat improvised command arrangements. The commanding officers were typically regular Royal Navy officers, but they were commanding a very different kind of crew than they would have found on a battleship or a cruiser in the main fleet. This mix of naval discipline and merchant seamanship was sometimes awkward, but it also brought real advantages. The former merchant officers and seamen had skills and experience that pure naval men lacked. They knew how cargo ships worked, what paperwork looked like, how trading companies operated. They could sometimes spot a doctored manifest or a suspicious cargo stowing pattern in ways that a pure naval man with no merchant background might miss. The boarding operations that were the core of the Northern Patrol's mission were in many ways better suited to men with merchant experience than to orthodox naval officers trained to fight battles. Admiral Dechair, the first commander of the Northern Patrol, was particularly attentive to the training and procedures of his boarding teams. He understood that the boarding officers were the critical interface between the blockade as a strategic concept and the blockade as an operational reality. A poorly conducted boarding, one that missed contraband that should have been spotted, or one that handled a neutral crew so roughly as to create a diplomatic incident, could undermine the entire enterprise. He worked hard to establish consistent procedures, to ensure boarding officers were properly briefed on the contraband lists, and to maintain the courtesy and fairness that the situation required. It is worth noting that British boarding parties, by all accounts, generally conducted themselves with considerable propriety toward the neutral crews they encountered. This was not purely altruistic. Rough treatment of neutral vessels would have created exactly the kind of diplomatic friction with neutral powers that Britain was working so hard to avoid. Courtesy was, in this context, a strategic requirement, and by and large, the boarding parties delivered it. Now let us talk about some of the specific ships and operations that brought the Northern Patrol to life, because the statistics and the strategy need to be grounded in the reality of individual vessels and individual people. The Alsatian, flagship of the 10th Cruiser Squadron, was one of the finest ships in the British Merchant Marine when she was requisitioned in 1914. Built for the Allen Line and launched in 1913, she was a handsome twin-screw turbine steamer of nearly 18,000 tons, capable of over 23 knots. She was fast enough to run down most merchant ships if they tried to flee, which gave her a significant tactical advantage in patrol work. Under Dechair's flag, she became the heart of the Northern Patrol's intelligence and coordination operation as much as a fighting ship. Dechair ran his squadron from the Alsatian's bridge and chart room, directing his scattered fleet of AMCs across the vast patrol area through the magic of wireless telegraphy, another technology that was transforming naval warfare in ways that the old naval manuals had never anticipated. Wireless telegraphy was, in fact, essential to the Northern Patrol's operation. The patrol area was so vast that no single ship or group of ships could cover it. The AMCs had to be spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. Coordination depended on constant wireless communication, on the ability to redirect a ship toward a suspect vessel, to call for backup if a ship resisted boarding, to report intelligence about suspicious cargoes back to the examination port authorities. The Northern Patrol was, in a sense, one of the first genuinely network-centric naval operations in history, even if no one would have used that terminology at the time. The Teutonic, which had been one of the White Star Line's crack Atlantic liners before the war, served on the Northern Patrol and was involved in the interception of the Christian of Fjord, a Norwegian passenger vessel that was carrying a number of passengers with connections to German intelligence. The boarding and detention of the Christian of Fjord became something of a celebrated case in the annals of blockade enforcement, illustrating the extent to which the intelligence work underpinning the boarding operations went far beyond simple cargo inspection. The boarding officers were not just looking for copper or rubber. They were sometimes looking for people. The examination of passengers on neutral vessels was yet another legally sensitive area of blockade enforcement. Under what circumstances could Britain detain a neutral passenger traveling on a neutral ship? The answer, worked out through an elaborate and often contentious legal process, was that passengers could be detained if they were suspected of carrying intelligence for the enemy, if they were reservists of enemy nations, or if they were traveling with diplomatic credentials that seemed implausible. The examination ports in Scotland and England, places like Kirkwall and Orkney, and later the Downs Anchorage, became processing centers not just for suspicious cargoes, but for suspicious persons. Kirkwall in particular became famous as the gateway to the British examination system. Ships sent in from the Northern Patrol would anchor in the harbor or nearby waters, and shore-based examination officers would come aboard to conduct detailed searches that simply were not possible at sea in rough weather. The manifests seized during boarding at sea would be forwarded ahead to Kirkwall by wireless, so the shore staff could be preparing their analysis before the ship even arrived. The examination process could take days. Cargo might be unloaded and physically inspected. Documents would be scrutinized. If contraband was found, it would be seized and the case referred to the prize court for legal adjudication. If a ship was cleared, she would be escorted through the British minefield to continue her voyage. The minefields, incidentally, were another element of the blockade system, laying great fields of naval mines in the approaches to the North Sea that made independent navigation through those waters extremely hazardous for any ship that had not been cleared by British authorities and given safe routing instructions. Let us now think about the German response to all of this, because Germany was not passive in the face of the blockade. The German Navy made several attempts to interfere with the Northern Patrol. U-boats were sent into the patrol area specifically to target the AMCs. This was genuinely dangerous work for the submarines as well, because the patrol area was vast and the AMCs were actively watching for periscopes, but the submarines did score successes. The loss of the Beano in March 1915 demonstrated that the AMCs, for all their size, were vulnerable to torpedo attack. They carried no armor. They were not built to absorb punishment. A single torpedo in the right place could sink one of these large ships very quickly. Germany also tried to use disguised commerce raiders to slip through or past the Northern Patrol and attack Allied shipping in the open ocean. The encounter between the Alcantara and the Greif in February 1916 was the most dramatic example of this tactic. The Greif was a German auxiliary cruiser disguised as a Norwegian merchant ship. The same deception in reverse as the British examination system was designed to detect. The fact that the Greif was spotted and destroyed at the cost of the Alcantara demonstrated both the hazards of the disguised raider strategy and the vigilance of the Northern Patrol. The patrol's boarding officers had developed a considerable expertise in identifying ships that were not quite what they claimed to be. The way a ship sat in the water, the details of her rigging, the layout of her deck equipment, the behavior of her crew, all of these things could provide clues to a trained observer. A genuine Norwegian coaster behaves differently from a German warship in disguise. Not always, and not infallibly, but often enough to give the Northern Patrol a significant advantage. The diplomatic confrontations generated by the blockade deserve considerable attention, because they shape the entire political context of the war. The clash between Britain's blockade policy and American neutral rights was one of the great ongoing dramas of the 1914 to 1917 period, before America entered the war. American diplomatic protests about British blockade practices were constant and sometimes fierce. The American government protested the seizure of American cargoes. It protested the expansion of the contraband lists. It protested the requirement that neutral vessels call at British ports for examination rather than being boarded at sea. It protested the blacklisting of American firms suspected of trading with Germany. And Britain had to respond to these protests carefully because the relationship with America was strategically vital. Britain was financing her enormous war effort partly through loans raised in American financial markets. Britain needed American agricultural products and industrial goods. And in the longer term, British strategists hoped that America might eventually be brought into the war on the Allied side. None of that was possible if Britain so thoroughly alienated American opinion through high-handed naval behavior that relations between the two countries became genuinely hostile. The British response to American protests was typically a combination of legal argument, diplomatic reassurance, and financial compensation. The legal arguments were sometimes creative. Britain argued that the Declaration of London, which would have constrained her blockade operations most severely, had never been legally binding because Britain had never ratified it. Britain argued that Germany's own conduct of the war, particularly the unrestricted submarine campaign that was sinking neutral vessels without warning and without any attempt to ensure the safety of their crews, was so far in violation of international law that it justified corresponding measures on Britain's part. There was real force to this argument. The contrast between British boarding parties, who were courteous, who followed legal procedures, who sent captured cargoes through prize courts for adjudication, and German submarines, which simply blew up neutral ships and left the survivors to drown, was stark and morally significant. Ultimately, it was Germany's submarine campaign rather than Britain's surface blockade that pushed America toward war. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, with the loss of nearly 1,200 lives, including over 100 Americans, created a wave of outrage in the United States that no amount of diplomatic protest about seized cargo could replicate. Britain's blockade inconvenienced American commerce. Germany's submarines killed American citizens. From the perspective of American public opinion, these were not morally equivalent. And gradually, through 1915, 1916, and into 1917, the unrestricted submarine campaign steadily poisoned German-American relations until Germany's announcement in January 1917 of a renewed unrestricted submarine war pushed Wilson's administration to seek a declaration of war in April of that year. The irony was profound. Germany had developed its submarine campaign partly in response to Britain's blockade. The submarine was Germany's asymmetric response to British naval supremacy. You have the surface fleet, Germany was saying in effect, but we have the submarines, and we will use them to cut off your sea lanes, just as you are using your surface ships to cut off ours. But the methods Germany chose to employ the submarine, sinking ships without warning, without allowing crews to abandon ship, and without caring whether the vessels were neutral or belligerent, were so fundamentally in conflict with the accepted laws of naval warfare that they generated a revulsion of international opinion that ultimately cost Germany the one neutral ally she most needed to win the war. Britain's blockade, by contrast, however legally aggressive and however morally troubling in its ultimate effects on German civilians, was conducted in a manner that at least acknowledged the framework of international law. Ships were stopped, not sunk. Cargoes were seized through legal prize, court proceedings. Neutral crewmen were treated with respect. The difference in method, even setting aside the question of effects, was the difference between a country that at least tried to work within a legal framework and a country that had decided the law was simply irrelevant to its strategic needs. And that difference mattered politically and diplomatically. Let us now think about the longer-term effects of the blockade, because the Northern Patrol's work did not end with the armistice of November 1918. In fact, one of the most morally troubling aspects of the entire blockade story is what happened after the guns stopped firing. When the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, the blockade did not end. The Allied powers maintained the blockade of Germany through the winter of 1918 to 1919, into the spring and summer of 1919, right up to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. The justification was that maintaining the blockade gave the Allied negotiators leverage over the German delegation at the peace conference. Lift the blockade prematurely, the argument went, and Germany might reject Allied peace terms and resume the war. Keep the blockade in place, and Germany had no choice but to negotiate. The result was that the German civilian population, already severely malnourished after 4 years of wartime food shortages, continued to suffer through another 8 months of blockade after the armistice. In early 1919, German civilians in major cities were subsisting on average daily rations of perhaps 1,500 calories, far below what is needed for healthy adult life, let alone for children who were still growing. The German Board of Public Health's estimate that around 100,000 additional people died during the post-armistice continuation of the blockade reflects the terrible human cost of using starvation as a diplomatic instrument. Even among the Allied powers themselves, the continuation of the post-armistice blockade was controversial. Herbert Hoover, then serving as the American Food Administrator and later to become the 31st President of the United States, pushed strongly for an early end to the blockade so that food relief could reach Germany. Hoover was appalled by what he saw in German cities, and he argued forcefully that maintaining the blockade after the fighting had stopped served no legitimate military purpose and was simply an act of collective punishment against a civilian population. His arguments eventually prevailed, and food relief began to flow into Germany from early 1919, but the blockade in its full form was not lifted until after Versailles. The post-armistice blockade has cast a long shadow over the historical assessment of Britain's entire blockade strategy. Critics have argued that it was not just a violation of the laws of war, but a moral catastrophe that helped to destabilize the Weimar Republic, the fragile German democracy that emerged from the ruins of the Kaiser's empire, by creating conditions of extreme hardship and resentment that made democratic politics almost impossible to sustain. Some historians have drawn a direct line from the hunger of the winter of 1918 to 1919 to the political radicalization of German society that ultimately produced National Socialism a decade later. That is perhaps too direct a causal chain, and historians debate it vigorously, but it is at least an argument that must be taken seriously. What is not in serious dispute is the strategic effectiveness of the blockade itself. The evidence is overwhelming that the blockade progressively crippled the German war economy in ways that materially shortened the war and contributed decisively to the Allied victory. German industrial production in key war materials declined significantly as the war progressed and imports of raw materials dried up. German agriculture, deprived of imported fertilizers and of the labor that had been conscripted into the army, produced steadily less food. The German Navy's own internal assessments, captured after the war, acknowledged that the blockade had been devastating. The revolutionary upheavals that swept through Germany in the autumn of 1918, the naval mutinies at Kiel, the street demonstrations in Berlin and other cities, the collapse of morale that made it impossible for the German government to continue the war, were intimately connected to the privations caused by 4 years of blockade. Bell's academic assessment that the blockade led to revolutionary uprisings in Germany and helped cause the collapse of the Kaiser's administration seems substantially correct, even if the causal relationship is complex. The contribution of the armed merchant cruisers of the Northern Patrol to this outcome was absolutely central. Without the constant, grinding, dangerous work of intercepting and boarding neutral vessels in the most difficult waters on Earth, the blockade would have been far more porous. Goods would have flowed through to neutral intermediaries in far greater quantities and found their way to Germany through legal or semi-legal channels. The boarding parties, swinging across to neutral ships in storm-racked small boats, rifling through manifests in cold holds while the Arctic wind screamed outside, were doing work that was absolutely essential to Britain's greatest strategic weapon. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the sheer organizational achievement that the Northern Patrol represented. Consider what it took to maintain an effective interception screen across 200,000 square miles of ocean for 3.5 years. You needed ships that could survive the conditions. You needed crews with the right mix of naval discipline and merchant expertise. You needed an intelligence system that could provide boarding officers with the information they needed to distinguish genuine neutral trade from smuggling. You needed examination ports with the staff and facilities to process thousands of detained vessels and their cargoes. You needed prize courts to handle the legal adjudication of seized goods. You needed a diplomatic apparatus to manage the constant friction with neutral powers. And you needed the political will to sustain all of this against constant pressure from American and other neutral governments to ease the restrictions. Britain provided all of this and provided it effectively. The organizational achievement was remarkable, the more so because it was built largely from scratch in the first months of a war that nobody had fully anticipated would take this form. The old strategic plans for a blockade had not envisaged the specific operational requirements of an armed merchant cruiser patrol in Arctic waters. The intelligence systems had to be built up from nothing. The legal frameworks for handling seized cargoes were improvised and adjusted as cases arose. The diplomatic machinery for managing neutral relations was developed through trial and error. That the whole thing worked as well as it did reflects the institutional capacity and adaptability of the British state at its wartime best. The individual ships of the Northern Patrol deserve a roll of honor that naval history has not always given them. The Alsatian served for over 3 years as de Chair's flagship before being returned to her owners after the war. The Armidale Castle, one of the Union Castle Line's Cape mail ships, served from August 1914 through the end of the war, a remarkable sustained deployment. The Arlanza, Almanzora, Andes, and dozens of other former passenger liners performed patrol duties in some of the most arduous conditions imaginable. The men who served on them, both the regular Royal Navy officers and the Royal Naval Reserve people who formed the bulk of the crews, deserve recognition alongside the more glamorously remembered sailors of the Grand Fleet and the submarine service. And yet, the Northern Patrol has never quite achieved the place in popular naval history that its strategic importance deserves. Perhaps this is because it was not a heroic story in the traditional military sense. There were no Nelsonian fleet actions, no dramatic battles against impossible odds, no chivalric single combats between named admirals on famous flagships. There were only ships in the storm and small boats in the swells, and boarding officers with their briefcases and their revolvers, and the grinding, patient work of economic strangulation carried out day after day across months and years until a great empire was brought to its knees. The story of the ocean boarding vessels is in many ways the story of modern total war itself. It is the story of how industrial-age states mobilize every instrument of national power, economic, legal, diplomatic, and military, in the service of strategic victory. It is the story of how the laws of war are always under pressure in the face of strategic necessity, and how nations navigate the line between what is legal and what is necessary. It is the story of how anonymous men doing unglamorous work in terrible conditions can be every bit as decisive as famous admirals winning famous battles. And it is the story of how Britain, the world's greatest naval power in 1914, chose to exercise that power in the way she had always exercised it, not primarily by sinking enemy warships, though she did that too, but by controlling the sea lanes, cutting off the enemy's trade, and squeezing the life out of a hostile economy until resistance became impossible. That strategic tradition of using maritime supremacy to win economic wars rather than merely naval ones runs from the age of Drake through the age of Nelson and into the age of the dreadnought and the U-boat. The Northern Patrol and the ocean boarding vessels were its finest, and perhaps its most morally complex expression. The boarding officers who swung across to those neutral ships in the Arctic swell were not just checking cargo manifests. They were writing the final chapters of an empire's history. Germany's empire, in a different way, Britain's own, because the enormous cost of the blockade, in ships, in men, in diplomatic capital, and the moral toll of deliberately starving a civilian population was one of the many costs that left Britain exhausted and diminished after 1918, even as a victor. Victory won through economic strangulation is a victory paid for in ways that the balance sheets never fully show. There is one final dimension to this story that we should consider before we bring our narrative to a close, and that is the legacy of the blockade for subsequent international law. The conduct of the First World War blockade, particularly the legal controversies it generated, fed directly into the development of post-war international law. The League of Nations, the forerunner of today's United Nations, was partly a response to the chaos of wartime international relations, including the breakdown of the laws of neutrality and the conduct of economic warfare. The conventions and treaties developed in the 1920s and 1930s, and eventually the United Nations Charter itself, all bear the marks of the Great War experience, in which the laws governing the conduct of war at sea were simply overwhelmed by strategic necessity. And the questions raised by the blockade have never entirely been answered. When is it legitimate to use economic coercion as a weapon of war? When does a naval blockade cross the line from a legitimate act of belligerence into a crime against humanity? How should the rights of neutral states to trade freely be balanced against the right of belligerent states to cut off their enemies' resources? These questions are still live and contested today in debates about modern sanctions regimes, about the blockade of Gaza, about the use of financial warfare against states like Iran and Russia. The Northern Patrol is not ancient history. The issues it raises are issues of our own time. In the end, what we are left with is admiration for the operational achievement, unease about some of the methods, and deep respect for the men who carried out a mission they had been given in conditions of extreme difficulty and genuine danger. The 10th Cruiser Squadron's boarding parties did not choose the strategy they were implementing. They chose to serve, and then they did their duty as best they could. 12,979 ships intercepted, 642 that got through, 9 armed merchant cruisers lost, over 1,000 officers and men who never came home from the gray waters of the Northern Patrol. Remember them the next time you stand on a harbor wall and watch a ship go out to sea. Think of the men who went out in far worse weather, in far more dangerous conditions, doing work that nobody much celebrated then, and that too few people know about now. Think of the boarding parties in their small boats, the intelligence officers with their lists, the engineers keeping tired engines running in Arctic cold, the captains standing watch on bridges swept by spray in the dark. They won a war, not with guns and glory, though there was some of that too. They won it with patience and discipline, and the most effective economic weapon in the history of naval warfare. And they did it from the decks of ships that 6 months before had been carrying tourists and mail across the Atlantic, in a kinder and more innocent time that the war had already killed forever. This has been the story of Britain's ocean boarding vessels, the armed merchants that inspected the neutrals, enforced the blockade, and helped to end the First World War. Thank you for spending this time with history.